Good evening, everybody. Good evening, all the members of Mumbai Surgical Society and surgeons across Maharashtra and India, and my dear students. On the behalf of Mumbai Surgical Society, I welcome all of you to our virtual lecture series in general surgery, which would be held every Friday from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Here, I take an opportunity and welcome Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, who is the president of Mumbai Surgical Society, as well as president of Association of Colorectal Surgeon. Dr. Niranjan was past president of Association of Medical Consultant. He is a GI at Bombay Hospital. Dr. Niranjan Agarwal has represented many surgical organizations in various capacities and is an excellent teacher. He has organized many national and international conferences. The lecture series is the brainchild of Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, who always felt that the knowledge needs to be dissipated, and he always kept on saying that all the surgeons who are practicing surgeons, especially, are out of touch with the recent knowledge. So that's what the idea came from. So here I invite Dr. Niranjan Agarwal to take over the proceedings. Dr. Niranjan Agarwal.
Thank you, thank you, Rajesh. For people who don't know, Rajesh, he is our honorary secretary of the Mumbai Surgical Society and a very dynamic person. Uh, Good evening, friends, and welcome to the first of its kind lecture series in general surgeries. Friends, you would all agree that medicine as a science is never static. In fact, the corona pandemic itself has brought more than thousands of paper on one disease itself. Similarly, even in established diseases, multiple changes have happened over the decades. Many of our practicing surgeons, as Rajesh just mentioned, find it difficult to keep abreast with each and every development which may happen. There are conferences which occurs to update the knowledge, but it is impossible for each and everyone to attend each and every conferences. So such kind of a virtual platform on a week, on a day of the week which is convenient and a time which is convenient to most of us, maybe not all, would probably help everybody to kind of relearn certain things, unlearn few, or maybe reassert themselves that what they know is still hold true for their practice. Needless to say that the PGs and the UGs where there are lockdowns in the classes and all would probably look nothing more than this kind of a lecture series to attend and upgrade their knowledges. Without taking much words, I would welcome you all and thank you for joining us. And a last word of thank you to Juventus Healthcare who came forward, accepted our idea, and participated in this scientific activity for the whole year. So every Friday from 9 to 11 p.m. you'll have different lectures covering the entire syllabus of general surgery under the platform of Mumbai Surgical Society. We are proud today and privileged because we have with us the president of ASI, Dr. Abhay Dalvi, who has agreed to do the honor of inaugurating the first series, and Dr. Kishore Adentaya, who is the founder of MSS. In fact, he was the one who motivated everybody in Mumbai to form this society. Both, and he's the past president of Mumbai Surgical Society. Both of them are present over here. So they are there to inaugurate and also chair the session. May I request Rajesh to introduce both the people and ask them to give their words of blessings. Rajesh?
Uh, Good evening and welcome, sir, Dr. Abhay Dalvi, sir. Dr. Abhay Dalvi, sir, of course, we all know is a president of ASI and is professor of surgery at KEM Hospital. Sir has, I think, almost all the organizations he had been headed, and he has taken, in fact, from Masi and Mumbai Surgical Society, he had been an active member, and he has always been our support and guide force behind all major organizations which across. Sir is an excellent laparoscopic surgeon and who has really done, apart from, people might know him about adrenal tumors, but I guess sir has hand in all the advanced laparoscopic surgery as well. Sir has really changed the picture of ASI in past 3 years. Things have really streamlined, and we probably knew ASI what 3 years back. Here, sir has always been encouraging to us, our students, and always being a big guiding force. And I feel to proud him, very proud that sir is a president of ASI, one of us who has always been guiding us. And may I call upon Dr. Kishore Adantya, a close colleague of mine at Bombay Hospital. Sir Kishore was professor of surgery, was at Bombay Hospital. He has just tendered his resignation 6 months back. He was a trustee in AMC, and he was a Masti elective committee member. So I call upon sir as well as Dr. Abhay Dalvi sir to take over the proceeding and introduce our speakers and start the session.
No, Rajesh,
Thank
first let them inaugurate officially. So Kishore will speak few words, followed by which the President ASI will speak, and then they will start the sessions. Kishore,
Okay.
your words of wisdom, please.
Good evening.
Good
President
evening.
sir, my friends, welcome to this first of several lecture series which our President Niranjan Agarwal has lined up for this year. This is the 8th year of existence of Mumbai Surgical Society, and we have always been believed in CMEs and been conducting several of them every year. Now, along with the MASI and the ASI, these can do much more to the surgeons. I sincerely hope that these lectures are very helpful for the postgraduate students, undergraduate students, and also to the practicing surgeons. This is a special year to us as we have our own Dr. Abhay Dalvi at the helm of ASI. He has been at the center of reforms in the ASI, which we have all seen in the last several years. A well-deserved recognition for a tireless worker. Next year is our chance to conduct the ASICon. It's really a daunting task. But I am sure with Dr. Dalvi and other leaders of Mumbai Surgical Society, like Dr. Naresh Rao, Niranjan Agarwal, Dr. Parvesh Sheikh, Roy Patankar and others, Manmohan Kamath and others, we will conduct a memorable meeting. Once again, thanks and welcome to the virtual lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore, for those kind words. May I now request Dr. Abhay Dalvi, sir, who's been my teacher also. In fact, the other speaker today is also my teacher. I have learned general surgery from both of them, Dr. Sharat Shenoy and Dr. Abhay Dalvi, Dr. Kishore. They have all been our teacher. So, Dr. Abhay Dalvi, your words of wisdom before we start the series actually.
Thank you, Mr. President. I bring you greetings from the headquarters of the Association of Surgeons of India. Let me go a little into COVID-19. It has struck us again as the second wave. This time, major cities like Delhi and Mumbai are gasping. There is a changed scenario. There is shortage of beds, oxygen, and healthcare workers are at their wits' end as to what to do. But show must go on. And so Mumbai Surgical Society is getting on with the show with a clear concept that education to healthcare workers is of utmost importance. MSS, I would say Mumbai Surgical Society, has really converted this adversity into opportunity to revisit surgery through Zoom, the benefits of which are there to see for surgeons who are attending this program and the postgraduates. The focus, I'm sure, will be on topics of interest with latest inputs that will go on. The Surgical Society has also given opportunity, as I see, to new speakers who I'm sure will do justice to these topics. Dr. Shekhar Jadhav from Grand Medical College, Dr. Pradnya Kulkarni, and Dr. Sharat Shenoy, who has been my 2 years senior. And I still remember the way he used to tackle clinics in instruments. Alice for tough structures, Babcock for soft structures. These are the words that I remember very vividly. I must also request the organizers to have a look at the HQ academic program, which can overlap, but it's good that most of our programs will be on Wednesday and Mumbai Surgical Society will be on Friday. So I don't think there should be an overlap. Again, I want to tell the organizers that if this is going to be live on Facebook, ASI has had problems of Facebook banning ASI of showing operative videos during the National Skill Enhancement Program, which took place in the month of March and February. I here have been asked to inaugurate this lecture series. So I formally inaugurate this virtual lecture series in general surgery and let the thing start. Thank you so much for inviting me. And lastly, please treat me as a member of Mumbai Surgical Society and not somebody from Chepauk. Thank you.
Sir, we are proud of your achievement that one of us have gone to Chepauk. So we can start the as chairpersons. Please start the proceedings, sir, and invite the first speaker.
Kishore, please take over.
Okay, we'll start the program now.
Yes.
Dr. Shekhar Jadhav, Assistant Professor of Grant Medical College and JJ Hospital, a new entrant to Mumbai Surgical Society, I believe. Shekhar, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Welcome, Shekhar. Welcome. Glad you have taken up this task of talking on pre-operative workshop and fitness for surgery.
Thank you for showing confidence in me, sir.
Amit, allow Shekhar to share his screen.
Very warm good evening to Chairperson Dr. Abhay Dalvi sir, Dr. Kishore Aditya, President Dr. Niranjan Agarwal, and Honorary Secretary Dr. Rajesh Yadav sir, and my all senior faculties and dear friends. I would like to start my topic, pre-operative workup and fitness. So what is the pre-operative workup? The pre-operative workup has been defined as the process of clinical assessment that precedes the delivery of anesthesia for surgical and non-surgical procedures. The primary purpose of this endeavor is to assess the known and diagnose the unknown comorbidities which directly or indirectly affect the perioperative management of the patient. As in UK NHS, guidelines are formed and updated by the NICE, that is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. But in India, sadly, there are no such national guidelines. Mostly the workup is based upon general consensus, local needs, and its associated legal difficulties. In India, there are no national guidelines available like those commonly seen in the West. One argument is often used by practitioners who adopt local protocols is that they deal with disease patterns, presentations, and comorbidities that are unique to India. Also, the overuse of investigations is justified, quoting the medico-legal grounds for protection in cases of litigation. This leads to overuse of unnecessary investigations and increases the financial burden over community. If routine laboratory investigation would detect a sufficiently high number of patients with comorbid conditions that alter the perioperative management, then it may be justified. But in such a case, it may also hold a valid defense in the court of law in case of litigation. The clear evidence of abnormal findings on routine testing that may impact management has not been found. The recommendations in the NICE guidelines for ASA and surgery grades are as follows. For routine elective surgeries, the ASA grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, that is a normal healthy patient. Grade 2, a patient with mild systemic disease. ASA 3 is a patient with severe systemic disease, and ASA 4 is a patient with severe systemic disease that is a constant threat to life. Now, in cases of minor surgeries, example like excising skin lesion, draining a breast abscess, only kidney function test and ECG are recommended in cases of ASA grade 3 and grade 4. Rest, all the investigations like full blood count, hemostasis, lung function test are not routinely advised. Similarly, for intermediate surgeries, examples primary repair of inguinal hernia, excising varicose veins in leg, tonsillectomy, knee arthroscopy, full blood count, hemostasis, kidney function test, ECG, and lung function tests are usually recommended for ASA grade 3 and grade 4, but only kidney function test and ECG are recommended for ASA grade 2. For major or complex surgeries, example, total abdominal hysterectomy, endoscopic resection of prostate, lumbar discectomy, thyroidectomy, lung operations, chronic resections, radical neck dissections. For all these, only full blood count, kidney function test, and ECG are routinely advisable for all the categories, that is grade A, ASA 1, 2, 3, 4. Rest, hemostasis and lung function tests are usually not recommended. So the basic aim of preoperative assessment is not to screen broadly for undiagnosed disease, but rather to identify and quantify comorbidity that may impact the perioperative outcome. This ensures that the patient is as fit as possible prior to surgery. If significant comorbidity or evidence of poor control of any underlying disease process is observed, consultation with specialist is essential. The role of preoperative assessment: it assesses the risk and benefits of the proposed surgery and anesthesia. It identifies any intervention necessary prior to admission and it assesses the patient's suitability. It identifies the post-operative requirements. It provides information about the anticipated post-operative recovery, as well as it guides the patient regarding any self-help matters to improve the outcome of their surgery. So what routine preoperative preparation should be done? First of all, history, physical and clinical examination, appropriate laboratory test, special investigations, preoperative consultations, type of surgical procedure and anesthesia required, previously difficulty with anesthesia or surgery, history of allergy or drug history, and most importantly, informed consent. All these conclude preoperative preparation. So what should be the timing of preoperative assessment? In emergency situation, the available time is very limited. But in elective cases, an initial preoperative assessment should be performed immediately following the decision to operate. Early preoperative assessment ensures that the patients with medical conditions require further investigation or treatment are identified early and appropriate action should be taken. And physical examination. Not to elaborate, as history and physical examination is known by everyone, but it includes information about the condition for which the surgery is planned, any past surgical procedures, and the patient's experience with anesthesia, immunization status, information about any chronic medical conditions or medications he is taking. Nutritional assessment. The most optimal means of defining a patient's nutritional status has not been established, but a general consensus follows that a weight loss for more than 5% in 1 month or more than 10% over 6 months plus serum albumin of less than 3.2 gram per deciliter and a total lymphocyte count of less than 3000 can signify an increased risk of post-operative complication. What should be given? The investigations usually are employed are chest X-ray, full blood count, ECG, 2D echography, glycated hemoglobin testing, hemostasis test, kidney function test, liver profile test, lung function test, urine test. Additionally, few tests are also employed like polysomnography, pregnancy testing, and sickle cell or triad test. Now, what about the chest test? It is not routinely recommended. It is recommended only in cases of all elective pre-operative cases over 60 years of age, all cases of cervical or abdominal trauma, acute severe respiratory symptoms, previous CRDs and no recent X-rays, thoracic surgeries, malignant disease, viscous perforation, or recent history of TB. Similarly, ECG should be only done above the age of 65 or the patients in whom significant blood loss is possible or all those with a history of cardiovascular, pulmonary, or anesthetic problems. Echocardiography is not routinely offered, but then it can be considered if the person has a heart murmur and a cardiac symptom including breathlessness, pre-syncope, syncope, or chest pain, or signs of symptom of heart failure. Full blood count. When to perform? In cases of all emergency preoperative cases and preoperative elective cases over 60 years of age, elective preoperative cases in adult females, if surgery likely to be result in significant blood loss, or there is a suspicion of blood loss, anemia, sepsis, chronic renal disease, or coagulation problems. Rest, even full blood count is also not recommended in cases of ASA1 and ASA2. Liver function tests are generally employed when there is jaundice, known or suspected hepatitis, there is cirrhosis, patient is having any malignancy, portal hypertension, or has a poor nutritional reserve or clotting problem. Clotting tests are recommended for patients on anticoagulants who have compromised liver function or whose surgery may involve heavy blood loss. Usually the urine tests are also not routinely recommended, but then if patient is having history of renal, liver disease or metabolic diseases, then it has to be offered. Consider microscopy and culture of midstream urine sample before surgery if the presence of urinary tract infection, if you think it will influence the decision to operate. Then urea and electrolyte, all the preoperative cases over 65 years, all the patients with cardiopulmonary disease or taking diuretics or steroids, all patients with history of renal or liver disease, all patients with history of diarrhea, vomiting, or metabolic or endocrine disease. In such cases, electrolytes and all are recommended. Blood grouping and cross-matching. In cases of emergency preoperative case, it is recommended. And also where suspicion of blood loss or anemia, coagulation defect is suspected, there also. Blood sugar, in case of all diabetic patients and patients above 40 years of age, including having people of family history, should be recommended with the routine blood investigation, routine blood sugar test. Sorry. HbA1c testing. It is not routinely offered, but when the patient is diagnosed diabetic, then it should be offered. People with diabetes who are being referred for surgical consultation from primary care should have their most recent HbA1c test results included in their referral information. Offer HbA1c testing to people with diabetes having surgery if they have not been tested in last 3 months. Pregnancy testing. All the women of childbearing potential should be asked whether there is any possibility they could be pregnant. Make sure the women who could possibly be pregnant are aware of the risk of anesthetic and the procedure to the fetus. Document all the discussions with women about whether or not to carry out the pregnancy test. Carry out a pregnancy test with the woman's consent if there is any doubt about whether she could be pregnant. We have to develop an agreed, documented, and audited protocol for checking pregnancy status before surgery. Sickle cell disease or triad test. We do not routinely offer testing for sickle cell disease, but we have to ask a person if having any member or family member having a sickle cell disease, then only such tests are recommended. What recommendations to be followed in comorbid patients in order to obtain fitness for surgery? Patients with cardiological conditions, like if the patient is having history of angina, coronary artery disease, myocardial infarction, there are some clinical predictors of increased perioperative risk, which includes unstable coronary syndromes, decompensated heart failure, severe valve disease, poorly controlled hypertension, history of congestive heart failure. So the surgery should be delayed up to 4 to 6 weeks after any coronary intervention like angioplasty. Elective procedure should ideally be delayed until at least 6 months following a recent MI. Perioperative risk for cardiovascular morbidity and mortality decreases in patients receiving beta blockage in the perioperative period. Patients with pulmonary conditions. Careful pulmonary function test is necessary in patients undergoing thoracic and upper abdominal procedures, as decrease in the pulmonary function can predispose to pulmonary complications. Specific pulmonary risk factors include COPD, smoking, preoperative sputum production, pneumonia, dyspnea, and obstructive sleep apnea. To decrease the post-operative pulmonary complication, smoking cessation is necessary for at least 2 months prior to the surgery. Bronchodilator therapy is advised. Antibiotic therapy for pre-existing infection and pre-treatment of asthmatic patients with steroids is necessary. Pre-operative strategies include the use of epidural anesthesia, vigorous pulmonary toilet and rehabilitation, and continued bronchodilator therapy. In cases of renal insufficiency, replacement of calcium for symptomatic hypocalcemia, use of phosphate binding antacids for hyperphosphatemia. Sodium bicarbonate can be used in setting of metabolic acidosis when the serum bicarbonate levels are below 50 milliequivalent. Hyponatremia is usually treated with volume restriction, although dialysis is often required within the perioperative period for control of volume and electrolyte abnormalities. Patients who have chronic end-stage renal disease should undergo dialysis prior to the surgery. Hepatic insufficiency. The patient with acute hepatitis with elevated transaminases should be managed non-operatively when feasible until several weeks beyond normalization of the laboratory values. The patient with the evidence of chronic hepatitis may often safely undergo operation. Decreased serum albumin levels can be corrected with pre-op infusions. The patients with cirrhosis may be assessed using the Child-Pugh classification. In case of diabetic patients, they may require early preoperative admissions to optimize the glycemic control prior to the operation. Non-insulin dependent diabetes should discontinue long-acting sulfonylureas owing to the risk of intraoperative hypoglycemia. A shorter acting agent or a sliding scale insulin coverage should be substituted in this period. The use of metformin should be stopped preoperatively because its association with lactic acidosis in the setting of renal insufficiency. Those with poorer control or on insulin therapy may require post-operative dosing and both glucose and insulin infusion during the surgery. When there is a known or suspected thyroid disease, patient should be evaluated with thyroid function test and ECG. Operation should be deferred until an euthyroid state is achieved. Hyperthyroid patient who takes antithyroid drugs such as propylthiouracil or methimazole should be instructed to continue this regime on the day of the surgery. The patient's usual doses of beta blockers or digoxin should also be continued. In cases of urgent surgery in a thyrotoxic patient at risk for thyroid storm, a combination of adrenergic blockers and glucocorticoids may be required and should be administered in consultation with an endocrinologist. Hypothyroid patient should take the thyroid on the day of the surgery also. When the patient is having history of steroid intake, the patient with a history of steroid use may require supplementations for a presumed abnormal adrenal response to the perioperative stress. In such cases, the patient may have taken more than 5 milligrams of prednisolone per day for more than 2 weeks within past year. They should be considered at risk when undergoing a major surgery. In such cases, titration of the dose of glucocorticoid replacement to the degree of surgical stress is necessary. For minor operations such as hernia repair, they require approximately 25 milligrams of hydrocortisone equivalent. Similarly, moderate operations such as cholecystectomy or lower extremity revascularization require 50 to 75 milligrams of hydrocortisone equivalent for 1 to 2 days. Major operations such as colectomy or cardiac surgery should be covered within 100 to 150 milligrams of hydrocortisone equivalent for 2 to 3 days. Coagulopathy. All the patients undergoing surgery should be questioned to assess the bleeding risk. Now, the patients who take warfarin, the drug can be held for several days preoperatively to allow the INR to fall below the range of 1.5. Systemic hyperonization can often be stopped within 6 hours of surgery and restarted within 12 hours post-operatively. Whenever possible, surgery should be postponed in the first month after an episode of venous or arterial thromboembolism. Aspirin and clopidogrel should be held for 7 to 10 days. Platelet transfusion when counts are less than 50,000 in a patient at risk for bleeding. Preoperative antibiotics. Preoperative antibiotic prophylaxis prior to the performing surgery to help decrease the risk of post-operative infections. The appropriate antibiotic should be chosen prior to surgery and administered before the skin incision is made. In adult surgical prophylaxis, usually weight-based dosing is recommended of single dose of cefazolin or cefotaxime. With the advent of minimal access surgery, the use of antibiotics seems to be less justified because the risk of wound infection is extremely low. Changes due to COVID-19. Emergence of COVID-19 has altered the future of perioperative medicine also, with increased emphasis on preoperative virtual visits and screening. Of course, there are some limitations to virtual visit consultations, but it has to be integrated with physical examination to reduce the visits of patient. On virtual visit, usually the patient should be subjected to questionnaire or a COVID survey with the help of Google Forms. Later on, he should visit the pre-op assessment clinic for physical examination and anesthetic fitness. The, the following slide shows the COVID questionnaire. Simple questions can be given in this format. Like, have you been diagnosed with COVID-19 in the past? Over the past 2 weeks, have you been in close contact with somebody who is having COVID-19? Or do you have any symptoms like loss of smell, taste, fever, cough, sore throat, shortness of breath, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, or muscle aches? Have you been in close contact with some unwell person who has displayed the above symptoms, or have traveled overseas in past 2 weeks, or have traveled interested in the past 2 weeks? Such a questionnaire can be obtained, and then we can assess and post him for investigations. CDC has outlined that when there is documented community transmission and if testing capacity allows, all the patients scheduled for a surgery or approved procedure should be tested for COVID on admission. Admissions for elective surgery should be tested for RT-PCR test 24 to 72 hours before admission and admitted only after confirmed negative result. On admission, if patient needs optimization for a few days, or if there is unavailability to isolate the patient, then repeat RT-PCR is advised 24 to 48 hours prior to the day of surgery. If patient is found RT-PCR positive at any point of process, surgery is to be postponed for at least 14 days and reassessment should be done. In case of emergency, RT-PCR test positive patient to be referred to COVID dedicated operation theatre setups. This is the standard operating protocol by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare Delhi, which shows the similar plan which I have discussed now. Similar type of protocol is there in which the anesthesia consultation is done after the COVID survey. If the COVID survey is negative, then the anesthesia consultation will be done with the help of again a COVID survey, blood count, RT-PCR, and plus or minus CT scan. If the patient is positive, then he should be referred to a COVID dedicated hospital. And if he is negative, then he can be posted for operative room. Now we are coming to informed consent. Informed consent is the process in which a healthcare provider educates a patient about the risk, benefits, and alternatives of a given procedure or intervention. The patient must be competent to make a voluntary decision about whether to undergo the procedure or intervention. Informed consent is both an ethical and legal obligation of medical practitioners. The documentation of all the elements of informed consent should be explained and noted in the language understood by the patient. The following are the required elements for documentation, that is the nature of the procedure, risk and benefits of procedure, reasonable alternatives, and risk and benefits of the alternatives also. It is the obligation of the provider to make it clear that the patient is participating in the decision-making process and avoid making the patient feel forced to agree to with the provider. Exceptions to the informed consent are if the patient is incapacitated, in life-threatening emergencies with inadequate time to obtain consent, or voluntarily waived consent. Informed consent is usually required for treatment, dissemination of patient information, specific procedures, surgery, blood transfusion, and anesthesia. Patient safety is a major focus in the healthcare, and effective informed consent is considered a patient safety issue. So the preoperative checklist. The preoperative evaluation concludes with a review of all the pertinent studies and information obtained from investigative tests. Documentation should be made in a chart of this review, which represents an opportunity to ensure that all the necessary and pertinent data have been obtained and appropriately interpreted. Informed consent should be documented in the chart, which represents the result of discussion with the patient and family members regarding the indication of the anticipated surgical procedure its risk and proposed benefits. Preoperative orders should be written and reviewed as well. The patient should receive written instructions regarding the time of surgery, the management of special perioperative issues such as bowel preparation or medical usage. The formulation of standardized guidelines ratified by both anesthesia and surgical societies would help reduce this stress. Thoughtful preoperative assessment has been shown to be cost-effective in reducing case cancellations on the day of surgery and in optimizing the perioperative care. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shekhar. Any questions? I have not seen any questions here.
There is one question, Kishore, if you see in the chat, Dr. Jadhav has asked whether doing inadequate preoperative workup will subject the anesthetist or the surgeon to a medico-legal issues in the if something goes wrong.
Surely, sir, it is a thing for discussion, and that's what I'm trying to tell, that we have to make some guidelines so that we can help it out in the court of law also.
But do you think that it is a wise thing to do this? The limit of investigations is never ending.
Right, sir.
It's never ending. You can never say that investigations are enough.
Enough, right.
But if the anesthetists are quite comfortable with certain set of investigations, if the patient pay unnecessarily, I mean, we as a fraternity, I personally feel that we should side with each other. That some investigations are basic, which are necessary. I don't know whether the court of law would hold it against you for under-investigating. So long as you have done the basic investigation. What do you feel, Shekhar?
Sir, I feel there should be some national guideline that we can present in front of court so that they can hear us and we can confidently practice.
But are there national guidelines?
No, sir.
So can we put it up to them to form the national guidelines?
Sure, sir. We can.
Abhay should be able to help us out with that.
Yeah.
See, I firmly believe investigations and workup is done for two reasons. Number one, from anesthesia point of view, and number two is from surgery point of view. It is for the surgeon. More guidelines you make, the more opportunities you give the court to come after you. So the lesser the guidelines, the better it is, because the court always believes in a doctor who is either defending himself or herself. So don't get into formation of guidelines, etc., etc. It will be futile to get to me USG of scrotum for a surgery on hydrocele. If I've got above the swelling, I've got fluctuation, I've got transublination, that is enough for me. And the court sitting there is going to say, okay, ultrasound was not required. Obviously, there are some surprise findings which come on. That is not your fault. Okay, surgeon is not complete, no doctor is complete, and that's written an unwritten rule. So don't worry about it. Tomorrow, the patient can also go to court saying that you over-investigated me for a condition which otherwise could have been treated by someone else without doing a sonography of the scrotum. What do you do? So best is no guidelines, clinical examination, investigations enough for anesthesia fitness and your surgical expertise, and go ahead with surgery. Every court will support you. That's my way of looking at things. And I do it that way. I don't ask unnecessary investigation.
I think that is correct approach. That is a correct approach.
It's the communication and understanding by the patient that what my doctor is doing for me is correct. That is what is important, and that it takes you to no litigations in future.
There is one more question, whether a physician certificate for fitness is necessary for all surgeries.
This has become a routine. There are classifications of physicians which I have my own. there are people who, without looking at the patient, will give fitness. There are people who will look at patients and give fitness. These are again classified into two. They will look at the patient. Irrespective of the report, they will give fitness. And after looking at the report, they will give fitness. I personally think Madam Pradnya Kulkarni is HOD anesthesia. She will possibly tell us about importance of physician fitness, because they have got clear-cut guidelines from ASA 1 to ASA 4. And that is where they become very important for us to know what opinions should be taken and what opinions need not be taken. So I think let us hand it over to her. She has vast experience and she will enlighten us, and the answers will reveal themselves. Thank you.
Pradnya, over to you.
Yeah. You hear me?
Your voice is cracking.
Hello.
Yeah.
Now can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you,
Should I
Pradnya. But
start?
yeah, you start.
See, I'm Dr. Pradnya Kulkarni. I'm from Bombay Hospital. I have been given this topic which are no boundaries. I have practically tried to compile whatever anesthetists are wanting to tell the surgeons, basically. Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you. We
Hello?
can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
We can, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, anesthesia is a relatively modern anesthesia, relatively young branch. Actually, from 16th October 1846, when the first demonstration of ether anesthesia was given. So, it is about 173 years of compared to other branches, and it is rapidly growing. Now, what is the most important part of the work is that surgeon and anesthetist have to work hand in hand. It is an absolute teamwork. And the most important part of this teamwork is communication. All the key decisions, this is the answer to the question that has come up in the last talk, is what investigations are needed to be done. These such decisions, type of anesthesia, choice anesthesia, all have to be jointly taken by surgeon, anesthetist, and patient. You know, and when everybody has come to an agreement and risk assessment has been, then only consent is taken and then you proceed with surgery. So anesthesia risks and surgical risk are independent of each other. That means a risk of only anesthesia is also present and risk of doing only surgery is also present. And unfortunately, both these risks are additive. One risk does not eliminate the other. In fact, they contribute to each other and they make a bigger risk. And some of the risks are interdependent. Like if there is a very low blood pressure, then the surgical risk is more higher, or comparatively there is a huge blood loss, the risk to anesthesia is higher. So combined risks and independent risk all effectively can go to an adverse event of even death. So this risk assessment has to be done very, very carefully before you come on to any patient comes on to an operation table. Basically, this can be the scenario in your operation theaters. Sometimes the left is true, sometimes the right is true. But basically, what needs to be the atmosphere should be the center. Anesthesia, as I told you, is a relatively new branch. It has evolved from very barbaric ways of 2000 BC to inhalation anesthetic to intubations to anesthetists with lot of automated machines, and probably the future is going to be anesthetists not even in the operating room. What is the changing role of anesthetists? Basically, we started off with ether scan and Bellamy Gardner bottle, and the name was Dabba Batley doctors. In JJ, we were called Anna Shetty doctors. Most of the anesthetists in older times were and the operation theaters had very few anesthesia equipment. To now anesthesiologists who are very scientifically, it's a like an upcoming branch, very scientific methods are come up. And currently the role of anesthetist is a perioperative physician. So basically anesthetist takes the role of physician to surgeon from preoperative to postoperative state. When should the anesthetist meet the patient? Not obviously on the operation theatre table, not ideal. Preoperative assessment of the anesthetist, the timing, the major is the surgery or more comorbidities, earlier should see the anesthetist. So maybe before days or weeks earlier, so anesthesia, safe anesthesia can be planned. Pre-anesthetic clinics are very useful, but most of the hospital and institutes still do not have pre-anesthetic clinics. Daycare surgeries are to be scheduled only after anesthesia fitness is obtained, because to avoid last-minute cancellations. Early assessment, I think some of the points are overlapping from long, but they are very important, so I don't mind repeating them. More investigation, optimizing comorbid condition, minimizing risk and minimizing the hospital stay. What are the aim of pre-anesthetic checkup? Assessment of major system, assessment of airways, assessment of the parts where you are going to administer anesthesia in case of block, spinal, monitoring accesses, etc. Knowing the allergies, allaying the anxiety of the patient. A lot of patients have a lot of queries regarding anesthesia and a lot of myths that if I get up in the middle of the operation, will I never come out of anesthesia? Similar. Ask for more investigation if they are not already done. Arrange for blood product, post-operative ventilation, ICUs. Then obtain a consent. Anesthesia consent has to be a separate consent, and it is not an implied consent. If the consent is obtained for surgery, it does not mean the patient has given consent for anesthesia. A separate anesthesia consent related to that procedure and type of anesthesia has to be obtained. Gross consent under any kind of anesthesia is generally not advisable. There are pre-printed form in which one can jot down which type of anesthesia is planned. Assess the risk of the patient and explain it to the relatives and the patient. Discuss operative, post-operative pain relief. Organize for intraoperative period. Specialized monitoring. Sometimes you may require certain kind of monitoring that is not available, so it gives a chance for us to arrange it. Administer pre-medication like antacid, analgesics, or sedatives. Special preparations are needed, especially in COVID period. We ask patient to have betadine goggles, or we can have nebulization for planned awake fiber optic. Available, the anesthetic should be available to patient and relatives to discuss the plan of anesthesia and post-operative period. Now, my guidelines are very important for standard anesthesia elective procedures in an adult patient. It's a rule of 8-6-4-2-0. 8 hours for high fat and protein diet and non-vegetarian diet. 6 hours for simple meals. 4 hours for liquid except milk. Milk is considered to be a solid food. 2 hours for clear liquid like strained fruit juices, coconut water, sugar water. And 0 hours, some patients are very fussy because of pre-medication, they feel dryness of throat. They are allowed to suck ice, but they should not swallow the water. Exceptions are in emergency operation. There are certain conditions where exaggerated NBM period is considered, like in MRI, where patient is trapped and is inside the tunnel. And even if patient is awake and he wants to vomit, there is a short chance that they will aspirate. Or even doing cardioversion, where the stomach is jolted and stomach contents come out. In these exceptional cases, you may ask for more NBM period. And now currently the latest guidelines is a POCUS. If in doubt, that is POCUS. POCUS is point of care ultrasound. So ultrasound can be done preoperatively just to check what are the gastric contents. And this has been done routinely in England, at least I know, and emergency emergency cesarean sections, LSCS, so as to make a decision about general or spinal anesthesia. Risk assessment is very important part of anesthesia, but anesthesia has no therapeutic benefit. We cannot simply give anesthesia to somebody for nothing. So anesthesia risks are very, very not taken well at all. Patient can accept the surgical risk, but anesthesia risk acceptance is very poor. Anesthesia needs to be 100%, though it is not possible, but near 100% safe for the patient. So we need to assess the risk and we need to explain it to the patient. Various stratifying scores are available. They consist of minor or major points are allotted to certain points. Points are given to certain conditions and they are added, and then the risks are stratified. Most commonly used is American Society of Anesthetists, which we have ASA. ASA is grade from 1 to 6 and E is added for emergency surgeries. Then we have for non-cardiac surgeries in a cardiac patient, we have Goldman cardiac risk. Then we have modified Goldman cardiac risk. We have Lee's revised cardiac index. Then for pulmonary, we have ARISCAT POSUM. POSUM is very commonly used in England, and mostly modified POSUM, that is Portsmouth modification of POSUM. And SALT, surgical outcome risk tools. So all these risk stratifying can give, many a time patient ask risk hai but kitna hai, so you need to sort of give them some mathematical value. Though I know for individual patient it is 0 or 100, but they like to see that is it low risk, moderate risk, high risk. So these scores are used for comparison of outcomes and give some idea to the patient. So Euro scores are there for cardiac surgery, European Society Cardiac Operative Risk Evaluation. So all these can be evaluated and a certain risk can be perceived and can be explained to the patient. So what is the choice of anesthetic that you want to give? So this man wants to have imported one and not a local anesthetic. So types of anesthesia are there. The local anesthesia, see, most of you all are very senior, and even the junior doctors who are surgeons, they are going into operation theaters and they are seeing the work of anesthetic. So I have not much concentrated on actual performing of anesthesia because that has been seen in operation theaters. But the perioperative points are covered more. So here we'll just go through a small, quickly go through all types of anesthesia. Local anesthesia, superficial surgeries, combination of local anesthetic, vasoactive drug like adrenaline. Various adjuncts can be used. Then topical like EMLA cream in cataract surgery, you can have topical anesthesia for conjunctiva, endoscopies, urinary catheterization, lignocaine jelly and all is used. Regional anesthesia consists of epidural, spinal, peripheral nerve blocks and intravenous Byers block, mostly used in orthopedic surgeries. Then we have regional anesthesia. So this is a means saying that anesthetists needing guidance to put in. When we were students, we used to tell the patient, ek sui lagega, and all the senior surgical colleagues from behind used to say, wohi sui bar bar lagega. So it is something like that. General anesthesia is 4 components. Total inhalational, that is called VIMA, volatile induction and maintenance of anesthesia. That is the original one we used to do with ether. Now even with sevoflurane, part of it can be still done. Balanced anesthesia is the most commonly used. For every individual component of anesthesia, different combination of drugs are used. So amnesia, analgesia, areflexia and muscle relaxation. Combination of many drugs that can be given inhalationally or intravenously are administered. And TIVA is total intravenous anesthesia, which is most probably will be the future of anesthesia, will be TIVA. As patients nowadays are becoming very clever because they are having so much access to Google. They are trying to, they read and half knowledge is more dangerous. So it is more difficult for us to convince the patient. So you need to really have a good discussion with the patient prior to deciding type of anesthesia. So what is the choice of anesthesia? What is the ideal choice? The primary aim has to be optimum patient safety. Patient should be safe at all the times. You cannot choose an anesthesia which is unsafe for the patient. Excellent operating conditions should be given to surgeon because he has to do his job well. Patient should be satisfied. Optimum post-operative pain relief should be achieved. Minimum perioperative side effects or discomfort. You cannot eliminate them, but you can minimize them. You must anticipate rapid recovery, minimal stay in post-operative room, and obviously, place like India, we should look for the cost. Factors affecting choice of technique are generally patient factors, surgical factors, anesthesia factors. Comorbid age, weight, allergies, airway, consent, these are all patient factors. Surgeries, type of surgery, elective, urgent, emergent, superficial, deep, which organ, what type, laparoscopy, robot, laser, whether you will use neuromonitoring, use of nerve stimulator. In that case, we have to avoid muscle relaxant. Anesthesia factors and safety technique, whether the technique is safe for the patient, availability of equipment and drugs to the anesthetist, and expertise of anesthetist in doing a particular technique. Whatever may be the best for the patient, but if person who is performing is not experienced enough, then it's not safe for the patient. Absolute mandatory questions. This is which I tell all my postgraduate students, and I'd like even surgical residents to understand, is these are the 5 things, that 5 or 6 things that you must do prior the patient is subjected to surgery. One is a consent. As I told you, surgical consent is not implied consent for anesthesia. A separate anesthesia consent has to be taken, even if it is sedation, even if it is monitored anesthesia care, a separate anesthesia consent is required. NBM status, even if you are inducing right patient on table bleeding, you must ask, abhi last kabhi khana khaya? Mishap in previous anesthesia. In India, not so much, but malignant hypopyrexia can kill a patient. So generally, in mishap in previous anesthesia, history of allergy. It is criminal to inject the drug for which patient is allergic to. So you have to ask family history of choline apnea and loose teeth and detachable dentures. You want to do good to the patient, you want to intubate in emergency, and denture goes and obstructs the trachea and patient will die. And neck movement, you must at any see the patient is able to open his mouth fully and neck can be moved backward. Mouth opening for easy intubation. If these 6 things are seen, even in emergency, even if patient is dying, 95% litigations can be avoided. What are the mandatory monitoring? Presence of a qualified anesthetic in the operating room throughout the surgery is the most important, time and again proven, the most important monitoring to minimize adverse events in anesthesia. This is not my statement, this is given by American Society of Anesthetists. ECG, pulse oximeter, blood pressure, invasive or automated, are mandatory for any procedure or any surgery, and for general anesthesia, especially laparoscopic surgeries, and for transport of mechanically ventilated patient, end-tidal carbon dioxide is a mandatory monitor. So MMM, monitoring, minimum mandatory monitoring. Record keeping. Record keeping is the extremely important part of anesthesia. What you write is very important than what you do. If it is not written, it is considered not done. So you might say, I have done it, but if it is not documented, it is considered to be not done. What has to be documented? Preoperative visit has to be documented. Appropriate consent has to be documented. Intraoperative drugs, dose, route of administration, hemodynamic, oxygen, type of anesthesia, everything has to be filled accurately and in detail. Post-operative record. When the patient is shifted from post-operative room to ward or ICU has to be thoroughly documented. Future of this documentation is real time. That means everything that is been in the monitor will be saved and printed. So what all we draw some flying birds on the chart are not going to be possible in future. There is going to be a real time recording, and most likely EMR recording is going to come in next few years. Recording is going to be extremely important. What are the common myths about anesthesia? Minor surgery is minor anesthesia. I have, in last 30 years I am in anesthesia. I have time and again come people, especially surgical, say, madam छोटा सा केस है 5 मिनट का है, उसका NBM नहीं है, उसका ये investigation नहीं. Minor surgery does not mean minor anesthesia. Anesthesia is independent of surgical risk. Short duration of surgery does not mean lesser risk of anesthesia. It reduces the duration of surgery, increases the risk of anesthesia, but just become short duration of anesthesia is not less risky anesthesia. pain is an inevitable part of post-operative period. Most of the surgeons say, sorry, but many of the surgeons say that the operation hua to dard to hoga hi na. But complete post-operative pain relief should be our aim. Too much pain relief hinders healing. If patient has too much pain relief, they do not move, or they do not sort of use that part, and then healing may be affected. These are myths, and I'm sure all of us know it, but I'm just... Spinal and epidural anesthesia can cause long-term backache, and sometimes it can last lifelong. This is generally myth among the female patient who undergo cesarean section under spinal anesthesia. They complain, "Abhi spinal kamar mein sui diya tha, abhi tak dard ho raha hai." It is scientifically absolutely untrue. A small 25 or 23 number spinal needle cannot cause permanent damage to get backache. For maximum backache can last in epidural up to 2 weeks, and for spinal anesthesia up to 4 to 5 days. Beyond that, any backache has to be evaluated as a separate cause of backache. Spinal and epidural anesthesia is a preferred choice and pose lesser risk for people with cardiorespiratory reserve or difficult airway. In fact, whenever we choose regional anesthesia, patient should be absolutely fit for general anesthesia. Anytime patient who is undergoing spinal anesthesia or regional anesthesia may be needed to be converted block safer, and when there are no facilities available for general anesthesia. So all the patients who undergo spinal, regional block, even sedation, proper facilities to give general anesthesia must be available. Suction and way of giving oxygen to the patient or IPPV should be available. Adequate NBM period is not very important for spinal, epidural and regional. As I said, all these anesthesias are, preparation has to be as much as it is done for general anesthesia. None of them precludes that you may never need to give an anesthesia. Converted or patient may not get in total spinal or cannot have any other cardiorespiratory problems. Anesthesia has moved, as we discussed, that you can see Sushrut on the left, and then you can see Horace Wells giving nitrous oxide for dental extraction, to modern anesthesia low below, and above you have a robotic surgery going on with surgeon doing robotic surgery. So what are the current trends of future anesthesia? Now, currently anesthetists are going more towards giving ultrasound guided regional block with conscious sedation. That minimizes the risk, because ultrasound minimizes the risk of local regional blocks and conscious sedation. But it is not possible in all sort of operations such as neuro, cardiac or major abdominal surgeries and all. So ultra short acting drugs through infusions are the common next best option. Non-invasive or semi-invasive methods of airway control and relaxant-free anesthesia are the future of anesthesia in next current 5 years. What is the long-term future of anesthetists? Anesthetists may go extinct or may become supremely important. We don't know how the trends is going to go. Currently, world is facing shortage of nearly 10 lakh trained anesthetists, so that every person in the world can have a safe anesthetic. In India, the ratio is much more worse, and that is probably because of the risk of and remuneration ratio is very pathetic. Future may see anesthetists who are trained in shorter period of time and specialized to a particular operations, so there may be that trend coming because of the extreme shortage. Future, robots is the future of anesthesia as is for surgery. Currently 3 robots are existing. One can take peripheral access, central access, perform endotracheal intubation and assist in giving regional anesthesia. Teleanesthesia can be used for, as Dr. Jadhav said, the preoperative assessment, training of personnel, and sometimes an automated machine can be controlled by anesthesia. This is the first intubating robot, and the world first robotic intubation was done at Montreal General Hospital. So we expect it to come into clinical practice in currently few years from now. Future of anesthesia is smartphone anesthesia practice, teleanesthesia, AI and AR, that is artificial intelligence and augmented reality, has a very huge role to play in anesthesia practice, because anesthesia is a very physical and physics and mathematical branch, and these can be easily applied to anesthesia. Nanomedicine, genetically targeted medicines in anesthesia, and auto anesthesia, that is TIVA or VIMA, can be done by auto anesthesia. This is a robotic machine which has a negative feedback loop, which is currently used for sedation in colonoscopy and OGD scopies. It has a propofol infusion and there is a negative feedback loop. So after you have filled up all the details of targeted infusion rate or blood levels that you require, it runs on automatic this thing, and probably need a senior well-trained nurse to supervise this. This is what is the current next 5-10 years. Most of it we already have. We have the 5 parameters monitor, we have the ventilators, we have syringe pumps, and few other monitors, and anesthesia with the feedback loop is our near future now. This is probably in about 10 to 15 years, there will be a smartphone anesthesia which is connected to the machine, and then all can be done through that. And what I may not be there to see this, but there will be future where there will be a single switch which can make you sleep and awake, as that can be mechanized. But I can see even coffee cups. So, and I think 2050 also, anesthetist won't be able to function without a cup of coffee. Now, Dr. Jadhav has come, said things about corona. I want to just quickly go through. Precaution for the patient, obviously, RT-PCR, HRCT, rapid antigen as required, betadine gargle. Patient must wear a surgical or N95 mask. Only one relative should be allowed throughout the stay of the patient. Responsible behavior and learning correct use of mask, sanitizer, hand washing, etc. Eliciting history, use of video laryngoscope, placing emphasis on a single attempt intubation, judicious use of muscle relaxant to avoid coughing and aerosol generation, preferring regional anesthesia, induction of rapid sequence intubation for elective cases to avoid aerosol generation, avoiding pre-oxygenation and bag mask ventilation through bag mask, wearing PPE for all the patients, correct PPE usage, N95, doubling of everything, double gloves, double mask, use double apron, and correct donning and doffing techniques are important. Proper hand washing, sanitization is important. Anesthetists to use intubation blocks or clear plastic for intubation, extubation. Avoid patient cough during extubation. Maintain depth of anesthesia to avoid coughing, bucking. Limiting use of fiber optic laryngoscope awake intubation. This is depicting both. You are having intubation block, the box, the plastic one, and video laryngoscope. HEPA filters, HME filters into the circuit, connecting scavenging outlets to hypochlorite solution, disposable circuit, disposable E2CO2 tubings, low flow techniques of anesthesia, intubation and extubation smoothly, changing soda lime between all the surgeries. Operation theatre needs to have a scavenging system, separate air conditioning, air cycling frequently in theatre, the frequency adequately, cleaning fumigation of theatres, the theatre staff minimizing their coming in and out, wearing all protective PPEs. Avoid frequent opening and closing of doors, yellow biohazard bags, separate and non-connected donning, doffing areas, only anesthetists and assistant, minimizing the people in the OT complexes. Precaution for surgeon must wear disposable kits instead of cotton gown, bag gown, quick hemostasis, suction to the cautery smoke, keeping surgical time minimum, deferring elective surgeries to allow sterilization of operating theatres between surgeries, and risk stratification of patients prior taking to surgery. General precaution is a buddy, that means somebody should help you with donning and doffing, because single-handedly it is not possible to properly don and doff. So there has to be a buddy for donning and doffing. having easily readable checklist in each operation theaters as to how this thing has to be done with photos, diagram. Hospital should avoid sharing rooms between patients and move patient who has become positive to appropriate isolation as soon as. I think 1 year down the line, we are all probably aware of most of these precautions. This is just like a revision. COVID positive patients should be taken into a separate hospital, separate place in the hospital in a COVID equipped theaters, separate air condition to those theaters, cautious waste disposal of such theaters. COVID positive patient minimum people in the room, restricted entry of hospital personnel, use of regional anesthesia, adequate filters, air filtration. All research equipment should be inside the operation theater and should probably be disposable. So basically 1 year down in Corona, we are back to square one again, and I must thank all the essential Corona warriors along with doctors and other healthcare professionals. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to put forward few points in anesthesia. As I said, this topic was so vast that I have tried to pick up few important things to put forward to you all. Thank you.
Chairpersons.
Prajna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And any questions? I see 1 or 2 questions here. What should be the treatment of post-spinal headache which is not relieved by hydration and head low position? Prajna?
2-3 important things are there. One is that you can apply a abdominal binder that increases intra-abdominal pressure and reduces the CSF leak. And the most effective and the last resort is a blood patch, autologous blood patch. You have to perform an epidural anesthetic and simultaneously take 10 cc of patient's fresh blood and inject through the epidural, and that seals the hole in the dura and reduces the leak, and it will stop the headache. But it is, if it is a spinal anesthesia causing headache, it is generally, it will resolve in 2 to 3 weeks. So general simple analgesics, coffee is known to help. Simple analgesics, lot of hydration, head low and abdominal binder should help. If not, then blood patch. Blood patch is a sure shot technique of stopping a post-dural headache.
Thank you. There was one more question about clopidogrel and aspirin. I don't see the question now, but I remember seeing it when you were giving the talk.
Clopidogrel needs to be stopped 1 week prior surgery, ideally, but 4 days in case of emergency surgeries. Aspirin, low dose aspirin can be continued perioperatively. For anesthetist, giving general anesthesia, clopidogrel and aspirin stopping is not much of an anesthesia risk as much as for surgeons. But if you are planning regional or blocks, then we also are more concerned with anticoagulants on board. So basically 1 week for clopidogrel, and I think 3 days for aspirin if possible, but low dose aspirin can be continued and spinal anesthetic can be given with low dose aspirin in continuity. But epidural anesthesia should be avoided.
Thank you, Prajna. There is one more question. Anesthesiologists are physicians themselves. Why should they ask for physician's fitness?
Very sore point with me also. Many times physician fitness are taken for completion. You know, many a times, as you say, we are practicing defensive medicine. If patient has a perioperative infarct, though I know how to treat it, or I know what precaution I have to take. But later on, patients say, why cardiologist was not involved? Why opinion was not taken? So most of the places, it is to share the responsibility and for completion, and basically to practice defensive medicine.
Dr. Dalvi wanted to ask something.
Yes, sir.
No, I don't want to ask.
Oh,
This
make a
is
point.
the most comprehensive, best lecture that I've ever heard from an anesthetist point of view.
Absolutely, I
Thank you
second
very
that.
much, sir.
And let me tell you, I'll let me tell you something. These are the people at the head end who are saviors for the surgeons.
Yes, sir.
And nobody ever recognizes their role. Nobody. My sister-in-law is an anesthetist. My wife is a gynecologist. In all cesarean sections, my wife gets peda as burfis. That anesthetist never gets a peda or a burfi, which is supplied from my house. So let me tell you only one thing, Dr. Pradnya.
Yes, sir.
It's also important to take a post-operative round
Yes, sir.
to meet the patient and tell that I was your anesthetist, because by the time the patient comes on table, the patient has already recognized cardiologist, neurologist, plastic surgeon, etc., etc., etc. And nobody even cares what is happening to the anesthetist, who is the most pivotal role, who also tells the surgeon, look, bleeding is too much, try to stop it. So try and put out a
Agreed,
thing.
sir. Our specialty is lacking in trying to, a little bit of laziness in not going and seeing patient pre-operatively or post-operatively. I think awareness is coming in. I think law is making it mandatory now for doctors to take pre-operative. Probably in future things may change.
Pradnya, forget the law. Go and meet.
People need that badaga. Or
you have to go and
very
tell that I gave you anesthesia, because of me your surgery has gone off well. That's the issue that I'm trying to put forward in this
yes, sir.
for the future generations to come. Okay, thank you so much. Very important lecture. And one more thing, try and put up an article on the whatever you have written. Let me see whether ASI headquarters can help you. Thank you so much.
One more question is there. One more question is there from Dr. Shivamurthy.
Yes.
In critical patients, do you take a video consent?
Right now, we are not taking video consents, but they are advised. And depending, actually, we see the patient, but it is always better to take a video consent. But so far, I haven't taken any, and maybe that is the future. Yeah, video consenting is probably the future.
One more medical legal question is there from Dr. Shivamurthy. For unknown and unconscious patient, what is the way of consent in routine and in emergency cases? Means who will give the consent? Niranjan?
Kishore, I think we'll keep a separate lecture on medical legal aspect.
Yes,
but
I know.
Just because it has been asked,
we have a separate lecture series for on medical legal cases. Okay.
Absolutely.
Consent is given, not will be given by administrators in good faith, and in court of law it will be accepted.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Pradnya, for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pradnya.
We come to the last topic by Dr. Sharad Shenoy. He is a consultant surgeon in Jaslok Hospital, Hinduja Hospital, and Raheja Hospital. He practices principally as a gastrointestinal and a laparoscopic surgeon, and is a very popular with undergraduate and postgraduate students. And his lectures are well attended. He has already recently written a book, which we will tell about it later. Topic is sterilization and surgical instruments. Dr. Sharad Shenoy.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Two things I would like to precede my talk. One is that I have not got any PPT presentation. The reason for that is very simple. I'm a computer illiterate person. I really do not know how to create a PPT. But I can assure you that I'll do a very simplified version of talk, which will be able to understand what I'm trying to say. Second thing is that Abhay told me that sometimes when your video is on, you tend to lose the communication. So I'm going to shut myself off on the video part, but I'm going to talk. I'll come back as soon as my lecture is over. I'll come back and meet you again. Okay, now Niranjan gave me a topic of sterilization in surgical instruments. Now I divide this method of sterilization in two categories of instruments. One are what I call as the sturdy instruments. sturdy instruments or what are called heavy duty instruments. You take a hemostat, you take a sinus forceps, you take a retractor. All these I would categorize them as the sturdy instruments. And second thing I would say is categorize delicate instruments or technically advanced instrument, something like a telescope, a cystoscope, a endoscope, those kind of things which are technically far more advanced and they need more tender care. Now, these two categories which are there, sturdy instruments and delicate instruments, the instrumentation and this autoclaving sterilization process can be easily divided into two categories. The first category for sturdy instruments is very simple. All of us know about it. One is a simple boiling. A simple sterilizer is available and the boiling is done. In boiling water, you place the instrument and keep that for 20-25 minutes, sometimes half an hour to get a sterile instrument. However, caution is to be given that these instruments should not be used in the operation theater. I'll give an example. There are many a times in the OPD, there is a large number of patients to be seen. We normally have about 2 or 3 proctoscopes in the OPD, and we have about 10-15 patients to examine for the rectum. So obviously, I cannot send it for autoclaving all over again. And that's the reason why we have a sterilizer, a boiler in the OPD itself. Most of the general practitioners have a sterilizer in their office. Most of the primary health centers have a sterilizer in their casualty. All of us have seen those things. We use all the metal instruments like a proctoscope, a Cusco speculum, a Sims speculum, a simple artery forceps, sometimes a tooth forceps for suture removal scissors, etc. We can use this. If I put a rubber tubing, if I put a latex gloves, etc. within this, obviously they are going to get destroyed. Very simply, in the olden days, we used to also put syringes and needles for sterilizing. However, today we know one thing, using a disposable syringe and needle is far more cost effective. They're much cheaper as compared to trying to boil a syringe and a needle. And with the advent, medical legally also, nobody will accept a boiled needle. I've operated on many patients who landed up with abscesses following this process sterilization. Why? Because they had an underlying HIV problem also, which was transmitted by such kind of needle. So definitely sterilization is only by boiling is only for those ones which are used in the OPD process, or in the theater also you can use it sometimes in minor surgeries. We can boil it for repeated use. Now needles, syringes, etc. is no more used in sterilizers for the simple reason that we have disposable adequately available. One more thing which I want to say, many a times in the casualty, you have seen our ward boys do suturing of CLWs. We use the same needle and we use the same thread. We keep on putting the thread in the boiling sterilizer, get it out, take as much as you want, put it back inside. Once again, the practice has to be abhorred. The practice has to be discarded. But all hospitals are not equipped with adequate funds, and hence probably they do this. Okay, I do not have any PPT, please. I do not have any PPT. Amit, I'm just going to discuss everything. Okay, the second best thing would be is to use for these sturdy instruments an autoclave. Charles Chamberlain, 1881, was the one who devised this method of using steam.
I think his net is interrupted.
Okay. The autoclave was discovered or produced by one Charles Chamberlain in 1881. He discovered that if I use steam under high pressure, I can kill most of the bacteria, including the spores. Hence, this is also called as utilizing of moist heat as a method of sterilization under pressure. That's the autoclave. Very simple. He made 2 drums, one fitting into the other. The outer drum he filled with water, closed the lid of that drum. The inner drum he kept instruments in drums. Various packets of drums is to keep it in the inner drum, and together he used to boil the water in the outer sheath or the outer drum, raise the temperature, to a certain amount of pressure was raised, I usually tell students a very easy way to remember this. 20, 20, 120. 20 pounds per square inch for 20 minutes, raising the temperature 121 degrees is a simple way to remember. However, it's not that easy. The pressures can range from 15 to 40 pounds per square inch. The temperatures can go from 115 to 180. And the time limit can go up from 15 minutes to 45 minutes. Let's give you an example. On an example, almost all the operation theaters in all the major hospitals, they have a central sterilizing unit where there are multiple autoclaves in the hospital. The entire hospital operation theater load of instrument comes to them, and in the night they autoclave all these things. The process goes by usually what is called as a slow autoclave. In the sense, there is about 20 pounds per square inch as the pressure is generated. The temperatures range up to say 120 to 140, and the time limit for which it is done is about 45 minutes. This usually helps to sterilize the load adequately. Now, this is called as slow autoclaves. There is something as a rapid autoclave. If you see in ophthalmic theaters, many of the private setups in corporate hospital, etc., they have something called as a rapid autoclave. Very simply put, if I can raise the pressures to 40 pounds per square inch and get the temperature to 180, sterilization for 10 to 15 minutes is adequate. Sterilization. So these are rapid autoclaves. So we can have a slow autoclave or a rapid autoclave. Now comes the question, how do we ensure the quality of my autoclave? What is basically done, there are two kinds of things. Every once in 6 months or 8 months, there is a bacteria, is a bacillus called as Geophilus, is called as Geobacillus stereothermophilus. This bacteria is in the form of spores. These spores is kept on strips or kept in a pre-packed vial. And this is kept inside the autoclave, inside the inner drum. This bacteria, this bacillus, these spores have a tendency to become a bacillus at 65 degrees Celsius. And of course, by 120, 130, etc., they get killed. So at the end of the procedure, at the end of the process of autoclaving, I take out this vial and send it for a culture. If the culture does not grow any of this bacillus, that means my autoclave is working perfect. This is one way of checking out. This is done once in 6 months, once in 8 months, depending upon to see whether the autoclave is running a leak somewhere, etc. Next comes the question is, today most of us what we do is that we always have a drum. Kamran, there is no slides, please. Okay. The second thing is that nowadays what we do is that we have basically a heat sensitive inked pad, inked paper. That paper, all of us have seen it. Most of us seen on the drum a plate which is black and white, half black, half white. Initially, before putting it for autoclave, it is green. That is a heat sensitive pad. And over that is a white strip. On the white strip, we normally write the contents, what is there in the drum. General surgery drum, vascular drum, etc. that is written. The lower tape, which is the green tape, when the process of autoclaving goes through that customary 20-20-120, that green tape becomes black, indicating that the autoclave process went through that particular period of what we wanted. This results in essentially that the autoclaving process is complete. This does not tell me that the instruments have become sterile, but it tells me that it has gone through this process. When it has gone through this process, we know that the autoclaving has been complete. Automatically, we also know that the bacteria must have got killed inside. So essentially, if I look at it, we have two options for sturdy instruments. One is the simple sterilizer, which is there in the OPDs. Second is the autoclave, which is commonly done. Now comes the question. Supposing we have delicate instruments, for example, a cystoscope, like for example, a telescope of a like an endoscope, etc., what do we do? Now, these instruments are quite delicate. Obviously, if I use moist heat or if I use heat over there, the instruments will get spoiled. Especially technically advanced instruments like telescope, like fiber optic scopes, there is a tendency for it to get spoiled. So what do? We have something called as a chemical sterilization. That's the next bit. I told you first was boiling, second was autoclaving, third is chemical sterilization. It is not used, some of the chemical sterilization is not used for these delicate instruments, but they use also for more sturdy instruments like the operation theater anesthetist trolley, like the operation table, like the window sills, like the floor, etc., etc. Those the chemical sterilizer used is Lysol and carbolic acid. Sometimes formalin fumes are kept inside the theater to sterilize the theater. So these are the use which are normally. So this is what we use normally for these things: chemical sterilizer, Lysol, carbolic acid. All these essentially are disinfectants. Now let me explain a simple principle. What is a disinfectant and what is an antiseptic? Antiseptic is something that is usually bacteriostatic. It suppresses the growth of the bacteria, does not let it multiply, and therefore it can be used on animate objects, on the human body. All ointments are essentially antiseptics. All solutions are antiseptic, therefore you can use it on animate. Lysol, etc., disinfectant. What does it mean? They're bactericidal, and they can be used only on inanimate objects like the theater flooring, etc., etc. Now comes the question: is that supposing Lysol, etc., are used, I can't use that for cystoscopes, etc. What do we use there? We use glutaraldehyde. All of us know the name Sidex. The Sidex is the one that is used for the cystoscopes, for the telescopes, etc. Similarly, there is something called as, there's the next generation called as salaldehyde. This is called as Sidex OPA. Oftal is called as orthosalaldehyde. This also is a disinfectant. And in the present generation, there is one more thing which has come as peracetic acid. PERACTIC, peracetic acid. What does this do? These are all again disinfectants. If you look at the peracetic acid, which is far superior, they say this is far superior to most of glutaraldehyde or salaldehyde. This is usually will inactivate gram positive, gram negative bacteria. It also disinfects fungi and yeast in under 5 minutes. In under 5 minutes at 100 parts per million. It's highly biocidal. It's an oxidizer. It removes the surface contaminants, principally the protein material on the tubings, etc., or the endoscopic tubing or the scopes, etc. Now, automated machines are available in which you put a small vial which contains 35% of Parasafe, as called as, along with an anti-corrosive agent. It's diluted with 0.2% filtered water. And this is run through the instruments inside. The instruments are cleaned adequately. All endoscopes, etc., telescopes, all these can be, cystoscopes can be utilized for cleaning in this chemical sterilization procedure. Having said this, I told you one was boiling, autoclaving. Third, what I said was essentially chemical sterilization. We come to the next one is ETO, ethylene oxide, which is there. It is basically available as a liquid. This liquid, when it fumes, the fumes, all the instruments that are kept inside this automatically get sterilized. The process might take over a period of 12 to 14 hours. Slow growing process. The fumes are quite toxic. And that's the reason why there is possibility. Most of the time we don't use it for sturdy instrument. We use it only for tubings, the wires that we use for endoscopy, for laparoscopy, etc. that we use this ethylene oxide sterilizations. Varicose vein strippers, which are disposable, can be reused by ETOs. These things that can be used quite easily. They are essentially liquid, which fumes. The fumes are the ones which are the sterilant. Having said this, something new has come up. You know the formalin tablets which were used once upon a time for all the I've used myself in the early days of laparoscopic surgery. used to put formalin tablets in the box to sterilize the instrument. Absolutely abhorred, not to be done. Nobody should do it. So what can we do? I'll explain to you that also. So formalin tablets was one thing which can be used today, is only to formalize the theater, especially when you want to have done an infected case. The next day you formalize the theater, etc. That we can do. That's a different story. Now, there is something called as a plasma sterilizer. This is a very interesting thing. Plasma sterilizer, which is the new kid on the block, which is supposed to be the most effective way of sterilization. Let me come back to this in a little detailed fashion. What is this plasma sterilization? Plasma sterilization uses a process of oxidation of the plasma, which produces a chemical reaction in which all the microorganisms are deactivated. Now let me explain this further. The complicated and technologically advanced instruments gets mutilated by autoclaving. Chemical sterilizations might cause a little damage to the thing, and hence these are best suited for this plasma sterilizer. Extremely useful for it. Now let me come back. This is basically a low temperature sterilization. It's very, very effective. Let me come to the brass tacks. Plasma is essentially a fourth state of matter. What is the other three? There is solid, there is liquid, there is gas, and the fourth state is the plasma. How is it created? When gas is heated sufficiently, or the gas is exposed to a strong electromagnetic field, the gas turns into a plasma. It becomes an unstable state of matter in which there are a number of electrons. Number of electrons either increased or decreased, thus producing ions which may be either positive or negative charge electrons. Now look at this. Thus this plasma has got a special property which is never seen in any other state of matter. The examples of this plasma state in the routine life, if you want to see, we have neon sign boards. They're made of plasma technology. Fluorescent light bulbs, plasma TV. All this basically is based on that plasma, but though it is not sterilized, a plasma technology. Now let's see how to do a plasma sterilization. I would like to bring this something else. Okay, the plasma sterilizing usually by the process of oxidation, it deactivates all the microorganisms through a chemical reaction. Let me see how it is done now. We all know hydrogen peroxide. In low concentration, like 20 volumes, we use it like a de-sloughing agent. Now look at this. In higher concentration, it can be used like a sterilant. Let me explain this. The high heat frees the molecules of H2O2 into free radicals, which are in a highly unstable state. And in their search to return to a stable state, they fix to the wall of the microorganism in the medium of the equipment. It effectively dissolves the components of the cells, like the enzyme systems, the DNA, or the nucleoli or the nucleic acid of the cells. Now let me see how it works. The process is as follows. There is a sterilizer into which liquid hydrogen peroxide is passed, high concentration. This liquid is heated in a vaporizer. This turns the H2O2 into a gas. The gas is further heated to very high temperatures. This turns into a plasma. This plasma is dispersed in the sterilizing chamber and the oxidation process starts. So sounds very interesting, very, very effective for almost all organisms that you want. Now, what is the advantage of this? It is supposed to be the safety of the environment, both the operator, because just imagine ETO, the fumes can be toxic to the human mind, to the human body. Other autoclaving, there is boiling water which keeps on coming and it can hurt the person also. So it's a safety both for the operator and the contents of your sterilizing unit. There are no toxic fumes, no long aeration or degassing of fumes. The cycle lasts for 35 to 45 minutes, unlike ETO, which takes 12 to 14 hours. And the end products at the end of the cycle are just water and oxygen. You know, H2O mixed into H2O and nascent oxygen. So obviously, both evaporate very freely. So where is the downside of it? It is horribly expensive. The machine, so maybe a very, very high end unit of the hospital can probably afford this, and maybe they are used. Most of the corporate hospitals, probably they must be using it. I wouldn't know that. Now, other forms which we all know is gamma irradiation. This gamma irradiation normally is not available within the hospital premises. It comes from a central nuclear plant, elsewhere like BARC, etc. These gamma irradiation for almost everything that we use today, from an angiocath to a Cavafix, to an endotracheal tube, to a Ryle's tube, to a catheter, to a Gospis, to urine bags, to an intercostal drain, to everything is gamma irradiated. Obviously, it has to be the best one. But yes, in the hospital circumstances, if you ask me, yes, probably this plasma sterilizer may be worth a try. But for sturdy instruments, let me recap the whole thing. If you have facilities easily available for all sturdy instruments, autoclave, there's no question about it. If you have specialty instruments like cystoscope, telescope, etc., maybe Cydex or Parasafe would be a good bet. If you have a higher thing which is there available, plasma sterilizer would be a better bet. Yes, these are all hospital surroundings, but gamma irradiation can be obtained only outside the hospital premises. They get all equipments are brought into the hospital and then used. Okay, this is the way of sterilization. Any difficulty or any questions, I'm willing to accept it.
Thank you, Dr. Shenoy. Excellent talk. There is a question from Dr. Ira Yadav. What is the best method to sterilize instruments to prevent atypical mycobacterium infection? Laparoscopic instrument as well as general surgery instruments.
As I explained just now, for most of these laparoscopic and delicate instruments, autoclaving is out. That's the first thing. Though cystoscopes, etc., autoclavable variety stores has manufactured it. But laparoscope, I would still feel maybe Parasafe would be the only thing. Or in this present generation, if I can get a plasma sterilizer, it might help me out quite a lot. Any other questions?
Is there any role for ultraviolet sterilization in operation theatre?
Usually no. Usually no. Somebody had asked me this question about ultrasonic waves, whether we can use it. Ultrasonic waves, I had gone into detail about this once. You just inquire about it. They are not meant for sterilizing. It can meant to loosen up the particles that are attached to your instruments, like blood clots, etc. It disintegrates them and separates them. Then we need to get it sterilized in some other form. Similarly, ultraviolet rays normally are never used. Like, for example, a simple thing I would tell you, if the ultraviolet rays are going on in the operation theater, we always tell all personnel to stay out. They are damaging. So maybe hard instruments, sturdy instruments, you might think of it, but not otherwise. And but when you have other options like Parasafe, etc., gamma irradiation, etc., if ultraviolet was good enough, gamma irradiation also would have been done within the hospital premises.
Thank you, Dr. Shenoy. Abhay, any finishing remarks? Dr. Dalvi?
Yeah. What is finishing remarks, by the way? Anyway.
Abhay, please don't finish me.
No. Sharad, I have learned under you. I was a registrar when you were lecturer in CVP's unit. So obviously I respect seniors, but it has been an excellent session. Shekhar, as an assistant professor from JJ Hospital, has done his duty, supported 100% by Dr. Ajay Bhandarwar and Girish Bakshi. who are the doyens of today's medical colleges, and I'm happy about it. Shekhar, do you agree? मोठ्याने बोल.
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
He is unmuted.
Yeah, surely, sir.
बोल शेखर.
Hello.
श्याम बोल शेखर.
Ha, sir.
तुला काय बोलायचं आहे? Supported by Dr. Bhandarwar and
Surely, sir. I am being supported by my department, Dr. Bandawar, sir, and Dr. Bakshi, sir.
and congratulations to GGMC, sorry, for your residents being selected at AIMS level. Just now I got a WhatsApp from Dr. Bhandarwar that many of our residents have been selected, even when they have not passed PG, one of them.
Yeah.
So congratulations and thank you for coming on board and delivering a wonderful lecture on preoperative. Madam Pradnya Kulkarni, I have already told you whatever I have to say. Never ever I have seen an anesthetist speaking from surgeon's point of view. Thank you so much. I had my own questions listed, but I possibly will meet you in Bombay Hospital sometime and ask you these questions for benefit of the society. Sharad, I cannot say anything about you. Please go ahead and read the book that he has penned on instruments. I have released the book on behalf of Sharad Shenoy with the corrected book that he is going to release. Please go through it. It gives you not only history, but the instruments that you use in contemporary times. I thank Dr. Niranjan Agrawal, the president of Mumbai Surgical Society, the founder president, Dr. Kishore Adyanta and Rajesh. You will be taking things forward. Zuventus, Amit Chakravarti. I'm again seeing 2-3 names of Amit Chakravarti, but it's okay. Thank you so much for supporting us through the year on behalf of Mumbai Surgical Society. And as president of ASI, it becomes my now responsibility to involve you in ASICON 2022, which is going to be held under the leadership of Niranjan Agarwal as the organizing secretary. Thank you so much, everybody. And it was fortunate that I managed to cancel the meeting and be with you all. Thank you so much. My thumbs up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Niranjan, for
thank you everybody, and
Thank
thank you
you.
for doing the honors, Dr. Abhay Dalvi sir. And the leadership in ASICON 2022 will be of Dr. Abhay Dalvi. We are his karyakartas only.
Karyakarta. Yep.
You have brought the conference to Mumbai, and we will see to it that it is a dream conference, not only for Mumbai, for all across India. I will thank you all the speakers. Dr. Abhay Dalvi has, as the ASI president, he has already thank you all. And from the Mumbai point of view, we thank you all for sparing your time and giving this lecture. I can see the comment there. Everybody has appreciated your talks. And indeed, it was a great learning after so many years to go back to the basics. And the next lecture on the lecture series, that is on Friday 30th, that will have topics on having IVSS and maintenance, including central line, the various type of drains, their utility, etc., and urinary catheterizations and their difficulties faced, and designing a surgical clinic or designing a surgical nursing home. That is what the topics for the next Friday meetings are there. There are speakers like Dr. Roy Patankar who will be talking on that. The Dr. Geeta Ghag is one of them. Dr. Anil Parak will be talking on the IVSS. And please be with us next Friday. And thank you, Juventus. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just want to say that people from other states have logged in.
Yes.
I've got a lot of WhatsApps from other states, and I have to congratulate you as the president of Mumbai Surgical Society. I'll not add on to your accolades as of now,
That's
but
big.
wonderful scientific program. Rajesh, you're doing well. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Juventus, Amit or Alad sir, if you want to say something.
Sir, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I would like to, on behalf of Zuventus, I'd like to thank all the distinguished guests. And it was such a wonderful first series, and which has been on a digital platform. We have telecasted across the country, and Zuventus is looking forward for the next session on 30th. Thank you.